Now then, it's time for Perspective today. And one of the issues that we talk about constantly here on France 24 is borders, whether it be the border between Russia and Ukraine, the US and Mexico, Ireland and Northern Ireland, India and Pakistan. All, of course, were highly controversial or challenging for a variety of different reasons. But are there links? Well, my guest today has tried to look into that, to take us on a bit of a journey, if you like, into the geopolitical conflict of tomorrow. Klaus Dodds is a professor of geopolitics at Royal Holloway, the University of London, and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. His book, Border Wars, The Conflicts That Will Define Our Future. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme. Daylight today, I mean, we can't start really, can we, without looking at that situation on the Russia-Ukraine border. I mean, it's the latest in a long series of border disputes, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think it sort of reveals well that the border is not just something that refers, say, to a land border that might differentiate, say, Russia with Ukraine. I think it also speaks to a profound civilizational identity border. So, President Putin thinks that, for example, part of what's driving his work is protecting Russian-speaking peoples. For the Ukrainians, it's really about saying, where is our place in Europe? Do we have a place eventually, say, in the European Union, let alone NATO? And we've also got these kind of wider, almost great power border struggles, in terms of where Russia, China, the United States are trying to feel their way, if you like, in terms of identifying particular spheres of influence. So it's obviously it's complicated, but it isn't just about, I think, a land border between Russia and Ukraine.
The idea of borders, though, I mean, it does bring about a real sense of patriotism, doesn't it, in whatever country you're talking about, really?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, borders are always linked to a kind of identity politics or a sort of wider popular culture. So, for example, when Trump said, I want to build that big, beautiful wall between the United States and Mexico, I mean, he was tapping into long-standing cultural sentiment that often saw Mexico as a source of, insecurity. So absolutely, these things are never divorced from those kind of wider cultural currents.
I mentioned some of them at the time when we've said Russia and Ukraine, we talked about US and Mexico, Ireland, Northern Ireland, India and Pakistan. Are there links between these borders, do you think, or do you think each one is an individual case?
I think that's a really good question, because I think what we often discover is that every particular, if you like, border dispute has its own unique set of dynamics. So, for example, if you look to India and Pakistan, they have this extraordinary border dispute, which is over a high altitude area that's glaciated, largely uninhabited, hugely difficult to control, let alone secure. Now, on the face of it, that looks like a world away, say, from the dispute between Ukraine and Russia. And yet, on either side of that disputed border, populations can become quickly inflamed, accusations get traded, just as your report suggested around Mali and France, for example. It's very common to hear on both sides of the border that there's malicious third-party interference, that the nation itself is in peril, even if the disputed region in question is thousands of miles or kilometers from a capital city. So there are these really interesting connections, what I would say are, one, borders are always related to cultural identity issues. Two, there's always a physical quality that makes itself felt. And thirdly, increasingly, there's usually a digital component. Conflicts are often fought as much on the infosphere as they are on land or at sea.
And do you think the issues become even more important more recently? I mean, I'm thinking about issues such as migration, obviously, international terrorism, that kind of thing.
Yes, because I think what the migration crisis of recent years affecting Europe has really, I think, exposed is this kind of hollowness. We tell ourselves that international politics is composed of nation states with fixed territorial boundaries and who claim exclusive sovereignty. We know that's a fiction. And what you find is, whether it's the European Union or individual states, they're battling against something that, frankly speaking, is an impossible task. The world is highly mobile, and things like climate change are making our world ever more unstable. And I think that's another reason why border disputes are becoming intensified. It's precisely because the world is in flux, and we're struggling, if you like, to impose these sort of fixed boundaries on a planet, an Earth, a people that are just relentlessly mobile and dynamic.
You put your tongue in your cheek a little bit in the book as well, don't you? I mean, you also look at the border with space, asking the question even, what would we do if Elon Musk declared himself president of the moon?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, borders is a pretty serious topic. I mean, I work in the field of geopolitics. I mean, it's not often you find time for humour, but I try to, towards the end of the book, suggest that there's also a kind of a ridiculousness to borders. I mean, I did some of my earliest research in Argentina, for example, which is very vexed about the Falklands Malvinas, and there were these huge disputes about maps, for example, and whether they were correctly named as the Islas Malvinas as opposed to the Falklands. Now, in space, I simply make the point that if you take this border logic to its extreme, you never stop. So why wouldn't you start portioning up the moon or Mars, or have ever more outlandish dreams about colonizing space? It never stops. And I think that's really, really what I was warning about, was that actually we have international legal frameworks for these spaces, like outer space, like the oceans, like Antarctica. But the point I also warn is that many of those frameworks were created in the 1950s and 1960s, where in the case of space, we only had two space powers. Now the world is infinitely more complex, and you have even places like Luxembourg, for example, as very much involved in space business. That was unthinkable in the late 1950s.
And just finally, I mean, I'm interested to know why you decided to pick this subject. What is it that you enjoyed and got out of analysing it, if you like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've worked on geopolitics for many years as a subject matter, but I think, to be perfectly honest, it was really about timing. It was thinking about why on earth are so many, particularly populist leaders, so obsessed with borders, and what does it tell us about the state of the world? And I think at the same time also, as we worry about increasingly and rightly about intensifying climate change, I wanted to make the point that as the physical geographies of the Earth continue to get terraformed, if you will, that will place even more stress and strain on borders, and if you like, our bordered imagination, that we're very, very wedded to. And I think the book really is warning, is that we need to change, because that kind of imagination, that kind of way of doing things, I just don't think is going to work as we go further into the 21st century.
Klaus Dodds, great to talk to you on the programme today. Thanks very much. The book called Border Wars, The Conflicts That Will Define Our Future. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.